At 16:41 and 19 seconds, the Combat Information Center aboard USS George H.W. Bush receives a cooperative engagement picture showing 48 inbound drones crossing the northeastern edge of the Arabian Sea approach lane, and every defensive console in the strike group turns toward the same sector at once. At 16:41 and 27 seconds, USS Mason's SPY-1 DV radar begins hard classification on all 48 contacts, while Aegis assigns threat priority and predicted impact lines across the carrier's starboard quarter. The problem is that the picture looks clean, dense, and manageable, exactly the kind of raid doctrine was written for, and that is why it is wrong. The system was built to defeat the tracks it could hold, not the tracks that were meant to disappear after being seen. USS George H.W. Bush has 6 minutes and 42 seconds before the first surviving drone reaches the inner defense ring, and less than 9 minutes before flight operations on the carrier can be forced to stop. At 16:41 and 41 seconds, the first intercept order goes out. At 16:41 and 48 seconds, the strike group believes it is already winning. It is not. To understand what is happening, you need to understand what Iran was actually trying to do. The carrier was not the target in the simple sense. Not the hull, not the island, not a cinematic deck explosion. The real target was continuity. A carrier strike group does not need to be sunk to be strategically damaged. It only needs to stop flying at the wrong moment, in the wrong water, under the wrong camera cycle, with the wrong radar picture, long enough for the entire regional balance to change around it. And Iran did not design the attack to defeat American defenses in a straight exchange. Iran designed it to make those defenses spend their time, missiles, and attention on the wrong layer of the threat. 48 drones sounds like a mass raid, but this one was built as a sorting problem. 28 were loud, 16 were dangerous enough to be taken seriously, 4 were the real attack. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. What the radar picture showed as a successful intercept sequence was only the opening stage of a more careful plan. The visible raid was designed to teach the strike group where to look. The hidden raid was designed to exploit where it would stop looking. 3 months earlier, Lieutenant Commander Mara Kessler, the electronic warfare officer aboard George H.W. Bush, and had submitted a 14-page assessment based on drone attack patterns seen in the Red Sea and satellite telemetry recovered from earlier intercepts in the Gulf. Her argument had been simple, technical, and easy to ignore. She wrote that the next serious drone raid against a U.S. carrier would not try to overwhelm every layer at once. It would separate the American response into 2 different clocks. One clock would belong to the obvious raid, the one radar could count, classify, and kill. The second clock would belong to a much smaller group of lower, quieter drones that would break formation, ride under clutter filters, and arrive after the command team believed the main problem had already been solved. She gave the concept a name no one remembered later except her: false mass, true silence. The paper was reviewed, marked useful, and filed. The carrier doctrine already assumed the outer screen, the E-2D, the destroyers, and the missile inventory would handle drone volume. Her job was not command. Her job was signal behavior, emissions logic, and the part of the fight that looked boring until the day it became the whole fight. She kept thinking about it anyway. She kept a manual notebook of low-altitude track losses. She kept timing tables for how long a carrier could safely interrupt certain emitters without breaking an air cycle. She kept one ugly fact in the front of her binder in black ink. If the visible raid is the point of focus, the invisible raid is the point of aim. At 16:42 and 03 seconds, USS Ross fires the first pair of SM-2 interceptors from 41 nautical miles. At 16:42 and 14 seconds, Mason follows with 2 more, At 16:42 and 29 seconds, with the E-2D, Advanced Hawkeye orbiting 87 nautical miles southwest, reports the raid now split into 3 altitude blocks, one at 11,000 feet, one at 4,200 feet, and one hugging the waterline so tightly that track quality is fluctuating with sea return. At 16:42 and 37 seconds, that last line should have changed the room. It did not. The air warfare picture still made sense inside doctrine. High contacts would be killed at range. Mid-band contacts would be thinned by standard intercept geometry. Low-quality returns near the surface would be cleaned up later by inner-layer weapons. That is how the system is supposed to work. At 16:43 and 02 seconds, 2 SM-2s detonate against the lead high-altitude pair. At 16:43 and 11 seconds, 3 more drones break apart. At 16:43 and 18 seconds, the first success markers appear across the tactical display. But that was the moment the attack began to work. Because success markers change human attention, they compress urgency, they create confidence before certainty. At 16:43 and 34 seconds, 16 mid-altitude drones flare their signatures, widen lateral spacing, and begin transmitting on overlapping frequencies, strong enough to dirty several passive electronic support measures across the group. They were not trying to get through, they were trying to become the center of gravity of the screen. Aegis reacted exactly the way it was meant to react. It shifted computational priority toward the densest moving threat cluster. More missiles were assigned, more consoles were absorbed, more eyes stayed high. Kessler looked at the picture once, then looked away from the density and down toward the track history. At 16:43 and 51 seconds, yet she saw the first thing that mattered. 4 of the original 48 tracks had not been killed. They had not turned away. They had not broken apart. They had gone low enough to be recategorized as unstable returns, and then fallen out of the main display logic almost cleanly, as if the system itself had helped hide them. She asked for the raw feed history. At 16:44 and 06 seconds, it came up. The 4 missing drones had each made the same move within 11 seconds of one another. A brief climb, a data burst, then a sharp descent to less than 30 feet above sea level. That pattern did not belong to decoys. That pattern belonged to handoff. To understand this, you need to understand how a smart, asymmetric drone attack becomes dangerous. The explosive payload matters, but the more important issue is what the drone is using to finish its run. And a drone that keeps talking can be found, classified, and jammed. A drone that goes quiet after receiving its last update can become much harder to sort from wave clutter, shipping noise, and broken fragments, especially when the combat team is already busy congratulating itself on killing the louder part of the raid. Iran did not need 48 drones to hit the carrier. Iran needed 44 drones to teach the strike group that the attack had already been understood. The remaining 4 were not built to win a missile duel. They were built to arrive at the exact point when the strike group's attention had become organized around the wrong success. Kessler had seen the weakness earlier because her whole field was built around an unpleasant fact. Systems look for what they are built to value. People have to look for what the system is dropping. Was at 16:44 and 19 seconds, she asked for confirmation from the Hawkeye on low-angle sea-skimming returns along bearing 108. The answer came back 7 seconds later. Possible 4, intermittent, very low. That was enough. At 16:44 and 31 seconds, she moved to the Air Defense Coordinator and said, "Stop counting what they want us to count." No one in the room answered her immediately because the room was still winning the visible battle. At 16:44 and 42 seconds, Ross killed another 3 mid-band drones. At 16:44 and 49 seconds, one of the loud decoys broke apart and rained fragments that lit up 2 consoles with false debris alerts. At 16:44 and 57 seconds, Mason reported 29 confirmed kills. At 16:45 and 3 seconds, Bush still looked safe. That was the false picture. The real picture was 4 silent drones, now 11.8 nautical miles out. It's descending between 17 and 22 feet above the surface, running a narrow approach lane that would carry them past the outer missile logic and into the hardest part of the defense picture, where the carrier's own size, the group's emissions, and the clutter of the sea began working against clean engagement timing. At 16:45 and 11 seconds, Kessler pulled her old timing table from the back of her board and made the calculation she had made in drills no one took seriously. If those 4 were passive terminal seekers using the group's own emissions as reference points, the most dangerous thing in the water was no longer the carrier. It was the carrier's signal pattern. The ship did not need to disappear. Its electronic center of mass needed to move. At 16:45 and 23 seconds, thus she asked the tactical action officer for 11 seconds of localized emission control on 2 specific sources and an offset decoy launch from the starboard escort line. The first response was exactly what always happens when an overlooked specialist interrupts a battle rhythm already in motion. Negative. We are in the middle of an engagement. She gave the answer before anyone asked for it. That is why this works. The quiet tracks are homing on the geometry we are broadcasting. Leave the geometry where it is, and they will not need to see us visually until the last mile. At 16:45 and 39 seconds, CIC finally began to catch up to her. The raw track history was rerun at higher speed. 4 missing contacts, same descent window, same bearing, same silence, same problem. The ship had 1 minute and 58 seconds. At 16:45 and 46 seconds, the tactical action officer gave her 10 seconds. She said she needed 11. He gave her 11. At 16:45 and 52 seconds, USS Mason was ordered to prepare 2 Nulka active decoys on bearing offset 17 degrees starboard of Bush's current emission centerline. At 16:45 and 58 seconds, Kessler ordered a brief cut and shift on the carrier's targeted emitters, while keeping the rest of the group alive and coherent. At 16:46 and 03 seconds, 1 MH-60R from HSM-46, already airborne in Plane Guard Station 3.2 nautical miles off the carrier's beam, was redirected low and fast to hold a look-down FLIR line across the expected approach gate. This was the non-standard response she had written about. Not more fire first, more understanding first. At 16:46 and 09 seconds, the Nulka decoys launched. At 16:46 and 12 seconds, Miss Bush's emissions changed just enough to move the electronic center of mass off the hull. At 16:46 and 16 seconds, the first 2 silent drones reacted exactly the way Kessler had predicted 3 months earlier. They drifted 6 degrees right, then 8, then committed to the brighter false geometry. That was the first proof. At 16:46 and 22 seconds, the MH-60R called visual infrared contact. 4 low, range 5.9. At 16:46 and 27 seconds, everyone in CIC was finally staring at the real attack. At 16:46 and 31 seconds, Donald Cook brought Phalanx CYWS to full automatic on the lead low track that had now climbed just enough to correct for the shifted signal picture. The gun opened for 2.1 seconds. The drone broke apart at 1,400 yards. At 16:46 and 36 seconds, the second drone corrected late, crossed into the wrong basket. And Mason's close-in fire cut it down 1,900 yards off the destroyer's port bow. At 16:46 and 41 seconds, the third drone chased the decoy all the way past Bush's starboard arc and hit the water 700 yards beyond the false target line. The fourth one was the problem. It did not bite on the decoy. It stayed quieter than the others. It held lower. It kept coming. At 16:46 and 47 seconds, the helicopter crew called it at 3.1 nautical miles, altitude 19 feet, speed 154 knots. At 16:46 and 52 seconds, Bush's own Phalanx mount began to track, lost the return in clutter, reacquired it, and hesitated 1.4 seconds because the drone was masked against the broken spray picture and the shifting geometry of the carrier's bow. That was the last dangerous second of the entire attack. Kessler did not ask for another missile. Oh, she did not ask for another doctrine response. She ordered one more emission shift, smaller this time, sharper, targeted not to confuse the raid but to make the last drone climb for reacquisition. At 16:46 and 56 seconds, the drone rose from 19 feet to 34. At 16:46 and 57 seconds, Phalanx had a clean line. At 16:46 and 58 seconds, the gun fired. At 16:47 and 0 seconds, the last drone detonated 1,100 yards off Bush's starboard bow. The entire quiet layer was gone. 3 minutes earlier, the strike group thought it had the fight understood. 11 seconds later, it actually did. The rest of the visible raid was finished by normal force. At 16:47 and 14 seconds, Ross killed 2 more mid-altitude drones. At 16:47 and 22 seconds, the Hawkeye confirmed no surviving inbound contacts inside 9 nautical miles. At 16:47 and 49 seconds, the Air Defense Coordinator declared the raid broken. But the important fact was not that the strike group had killed 48 drones. The important fact was that 44 of them had never been the problem. The 4 that mattered were designed to arrive after the Americans believed the visible battle was already over. That was Iran's real plan, not a direct sinking, not a dramatic one-shot kill, a forced interruption. A carrier stopped at the edge of a new theater, a public demonstration that the outer shield could be made to look strong while the inner picture quietly failed. Iran built the visible raid to occupy doctrine and the silent raid to exploit human relief. It failed because one officer whose job had nothing to do with command had already spent months thinking about how a successful defense could hide an incoming defeat. At 16:56 and 40 seconds, George H.W. Bush resumed full flight operations. The ship never stopped sailing. The formation never broke. 17 minutes later, an EA-18G and 2 FA-18Fs launched from Bush, with targeting data built from the recovered track logic and the final drone handoff pattern. 2 hours and 13 minutes after the raid, U.S. strikes destroyed 3 mobile drone relay vehicles and 2 containerized launch positions tied to the attack chain. No aircraft were lost. No deck operations were shut down. No carrier escort was forced out of station. 48 drones had been sent toward USS George H.W. Bush as it entered the Arabian Sea. The visible attack was defeated by the strike group's weapons. The real attack was defeated by a single idea. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. As Iran had spent weeks building a weapon designed to make the carrier's defenses useless. It failed because the one person whose job had nothing to do with direct combat had already seen exactly where the real attack would come from.